This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Hello, and welcome back to this class on learning to use the Greek New Testament, and in particular, this class on the language tools that are available to us as we study through the Greek New Testament. And what we're going to be doing in this particular unit is focusing on how we can use those tools, what tools are available, what are their titles, and how they can be utilized in preparing sermons and our Bible classes and for our own personal use. I'm looking forward to this unit because I think it's a very practical part of this course. And so today we're going to start off on talking about what Greek text of the New Testament do we use. And as we begin that particular discussion, I want to pose a question to you, a question probably you have asked many times, and I've had many people ask me this question. And that is, why do certain translations of the Bible omit certain verses that, for example, the King James translation would include? Here's one example of what I'm talking about. In Acts chapter 8, verse 37, and this is from the King James translation, the Bible says, "And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." Now, if I were to turn over, for example, in this Bible that I'm holding in my hand, it's an American Standard Version, translated in 1901, or published in 1901, you'll find that in that translation, verse 37 is omitted in the text. We go directly from verse 38 right to verse 39. However, there is a footnote with this verse 37 from the King James translation, included in the footnote with this comment: "Some ancient authorities insert wholly or in part," verse 37. Well, what are they talking about, ancient authorities? And why, again, do some translations, like the American Standard Version, omit this particular passage, as well as, for example, 1 John 5 and verse 7, elements of that verse that are included by the King James and the New King James and perhaps some other translations? Why do they do that? The reason is because various translators or translations base their translation upon a Greek text that they utilized. And there are roughly three different types of Greek text or Greek text traditions that we'll show you and talk about in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to just sort of take you back in time for just a second. Go back in time to when these translations were, or when the Bible was originally written. We call those manuscripts the autographs, the ones actually penned by Paul and John and Peter and so forth. What happened to those? Well, no one knows for sure. We don't have those copies today, and I think probably there's a good reason for that, because some, if they were found, would venerate those. They would perhaps worship those or claim some sort of authority in the religious matters because they had that initial copy. But we don't have it, or that initial manuscript. We don't have that initial manuscript, that first one, that autograph. But we do have many, many Greek copies, or copies of the New Testament in Greek, known as a manuscript. Sometimes they're in fragments, sometimes they're in book forms like a codex, they're written on papyrus, they're written on animal skin like vellum and so forth. And after the years went by, more and more copies were made of the Bible, and these copies, again, survive in the Greek form. They exist in various versions, such as the Coptic version, Ethiopic version from Egypt, and the Syriac version, the Peshitta. Other translations exist of the Bible, but there are Greek manuscripts that hold a very, very important role in textual criticism. All right, now, over time, the Bible was translated, for example, into Latin, and that particular Latin translation, the Vulgate, became the official Bible of the Catholic Church. And as time went by, then some began to say, for example, John Wycliffe, that we ought to translate the Bible into the vernacular or the language of the people. And so what he did was he made an English copy of the Bible, but he utilized the Latin Vulgate to do that. Okay, he went to the Latin and made then translated the Bible into English based on the Latin. Well, then as a few more years went by, others began to say, well, why not make a copy of the New Testament into English based on the Greek manuscripts, some of the older Greek manuscripts that we might have. And there were several copies that were brought together that were representative of a large text type family, of a particular family of manuscripts that existed. And they looked at those manuscripts, realized that there were some, maybe from time to time, maybe a slight variation in the spelling of a word, or maybe in the omission of a verse, but they brought together those manuscripts and formed what became the basis of formed the basis for the King James translation. And that particular text, that particular Greek text became known as the Textus Receptus. And there's a lot more to be said about that, and a lot of history involved and how that came to be and so forth. But the text type that underlies the translation of the King James Bible is known as the Textus Receptus. And I have a copy of the Textus Receptus right here. He kainai diatheke is written here. And this particular one is published by the Trinitarian Bible Society. And you can get a copy of this in a lot of different places. It comes in a lot of different forms and sizes. For example, I have one that is leather bound here, but it's the same text, okay? It's the same text. And it's known as the Textus Receptus, the received text. Let's notice a few things about the received text that you want to keep in mind as you think about this copy of the Greek New Testament. It was assembled in the early 17th century, and it is also representative of the text used by the King James translators. All right, the word Textus Receptus means received text. All right, so that's one particular copy of the Greek New Testament. There's also then another particular text tradition that is represented by these particular books here, pretty much one and the same. And again, I want to emphasize something to you, that when we're talking about these texts, same stories of the Bible, there's not as though there are any great differences. There are a few times in which certain verses might be omitted, as we're talking about, but the same stories, the same verses, same words, nothing to be concerned about. It's just that over time, as you can imagine, because the copyists were not inspired, that from time to time they may have omitted a verse and that didn't survive, or a verse may have been omitted that did not survive in later manuscripts and so forth. But at any rate, you have then this particular text tradition, philosophy, that is known as the eclectic text. Let's take a look at it here now and see some distinguishing characteristics about the eclectic text, sometimes called the critical text. And here's what we want to know about it. Due to the discovery of previously unknown ancient manuscripts, a newer text tradition became popular, sometimes characterized by the tendency to rely upon early 4th century manuscripts such as the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. All right, something else about it. It is a Greek text assembled on the basis of critical judgments made by scholars for each particular variant. All right, and then the best known publications of this text tradition are the Nestle's text, known as the Novum Testamentum, 27th edition, published in 1993, and also the United Bible Society text, known as the Greek New Testament, and it was in its 4th edition in 1993. Now, one of the things I want to again sort of point out is this, that when the King James translators made their particular translation, they used, again, several manuscripts that were representative of a family of manuscripts that represent what we'll talk about a little later on, the majority text tradition. But they did not have access to some other manuscripts that became available and made known in the late 1800s. A man by the name of Tischendorf discovered a manuscript at the monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, and it was a manuscript that was well preserved, that dated back to the 4th century, about the 325 AD era, right around there. Well preserved, well intact, And of course, what's suspect about it is that it was so well preserved as though maybe it was not used, and that some make that as an argument as to maybe why it wasn't as an accepted manuscript as were some. But nevertheless, because that manuscript and a few others, or others that were found in later years that the King James translators did not have access to, because of that, it was felt that a new Greek Testament needed to be assembled. And so what took place was this, that with the discovery of those manuscripts, they found that there were some differences on occasion in those manuscripts from those which had been used by the King James translators. That there were a few times in which certain verses were omitted. For example, verses 9 through 20 of the Gospel according to Mark. And so because that manuscript was older and more well preserved, textual critics felt as though that greater weight should be given to it. And that when it comes to a textual variant, in other words, a difference between a manuscript over here and another manuscript over here, and when there was a difference in terms of the spelling of a word or the omission or the inclusion of a word or something, they opted to go with the older manuscript and rely more heavily upon that. And so, for example, two scholars by the name of Westcott and Hort put together their own Greek copy of the Bible based on pretty much that manuscript of the Sinaiticus manuscript. Well, then a tradition started of scholarship, of trying to do the very best we can, of looking at each of those variants and deciding which one they felt should be in the Bible, should be in the New Testament. And so a particular set of, a particular tradition was started. I'm going to put one of these aside and just use one of them now, known as, again, this eclectic text, in which they looked at variant by variant, the differences in the manuscripts, and decided to give it a grade as to whether or not they felt like it should be included in the New Testament. Now you'll notice that if you were to open up this book, this Greek New Testament, again represented by the United Bible Society, with the Nestle text, also known as the UBS text, but that represents the eclectic method, or some people call it the critical text. And so what they would do on a particular verse is give it a grade as to how confident they were it should be in the New Testament. And then they would give you the phrase, and maybe over here give you a symbol telling you which manuscripts would include it. And if you look closely, you would see an olive, which represented the Sinaiticus manuscript, that it was in there, and maybe the Alexandrians or the Vaticanus or something all the way down. And so this is known as the critical apparatus. A discussion was made giving you their notes as to why they included it or maybe why it was omitted and so forth, okay? So, but again, sort of the criticism in regard to this particular method of the Greek text is that it is primarily based upon the tradition that says that the older manuscripts are the best, even those older ones that have been discovered, the extant copies, the ones that exist today, that those are the ones that we should rely upon more than perhaps all the other manuscripts that exist, the thousands out there that maybe say something a little different because they may not be quite as old. And so anyway, an interesting concept and important perhaps to think about, but you have this particular text type tradition. All right, so you've got the Textus Receptus, all right, upon which the King James translators based their translation, or this particular text type. And then you've got the critical text, okay, represented by the United Bible Society and the Nestle Aland text. And then the third particular tradition has to do with what's known as the majority text. The majority text. Let's take a look at a couple of things in relationship to that. Notice that this is a text tradition which is closely aligned with the Textus Receptus. Okay? It favors the inclusion of all readings which can be attested in the majority of Greek manuscripts, hence its name, okay, and given consideration based on their family text type. Also, it is represented by the editors Zane C. Hodges and Arthur L. Farstad in their text, the Greek New Testament according to the majority text. And that's this one right here that I'm holding in my hand. And essentially, the philosophy behind the assembling of this Greek text is this. They said, let's take a look at all the available Greek manuscripts. Let's take a look at all of them, over 5,000, and let's find the majority reading. Does, for example, Acts 8:37 appear in the majority of the existing manuscripts? Or is there good reason to believe that it came from a text that had been a set of manuscripts that had been handed down that was representative of a family of manuscripts that has its roots deeply entrenched in a tradition of manuscripts, or a style or a family of manuscripts? And if so, then that's included. And their contention is this, that we should not ignore or any science that or discipline that ignores over 80% or 85% of the available data to them is really not good science. And so what they were suggesting is that when, for example, the eclectic text ignores 80 to 85% of the manuscript material available to them in favor of a few, then perhaps that's not a very good way of determining what verses for sure ought to be included in the Bible. And again, I don't want to sort of frighten you into thinking that, well, are huge portions of the Bible missing? No, there are a few questions in regard to a few verses, but I think, again, this is sort of a sound principle in my mind, and one that I like to hold to, the majority text principle, which says, let's look at all the Greek manuscripts, let's take what reading is found in the majority of them and include that and assemble then one Greek text. Instead of you and I having to sit down with all of these 5,000 Greek manuscripts, someone has come along and said, we need one Greek text, and then let's make our translation based on that. So, what would I recommend to you? Well, if at all possible, to have all three different types of text before you in studying through, so you can see those textual variants, make some comparisons. At times an article may be left out, the article "the," sometimes it might be included and so forth. That might have some bearing on how you would teach a particular passage or whatever. But again, is there any reason to doubt about whether or not we have the Word of God and the truth? Absolutely not. It is contained in those thousands of manuscripts, more manuscripts for the Bible than any other ancient document in history. Now, just to give you some idea of the kind of information or kinds of resources that you can consult about this subject, to sort of give you a spectrum of what's out there, of the kinds of things that you can research, both on the what some might consider very conservative side that would say that the Textus Receptus is the only text that we should hold on to, and that the King James is the only version we should use, down to those who would say, let's be reasonable and let's hold to the eclectic text method. And so I'm going to let you read those and refer you to those to show you that there is a body of literature that would sort of argue for each one of these and let you make your own decision. I've made my decision that I believe the majority text principle is a principle that I'm going to embrace and utilize that as my primary Greek text. What are some of those resources? Well, there are a lot of different ones that are available to us. For example, here's one, the Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration by Bruce M. Metzger, a well-known text, and it is published by Oxford University Press. Then you've got also on the other extreme, perhaps, as some might speak of it, a book called Which Bible by David Otis Fuller, Which Bible. And in there's a lot of discussion about the team of translators that translated the King James translation, or made that translation, and the scholarship behind it, and the text that they used. And in fact, Zane Hodges has a particular chapter in here called the Greek text of the King James Version, and in which he says again that while yes, they didn't use very many manuscripts, they used manuscripts that were representative of the majority of manuscripts that do exist today. And so he makes, I think, a fairly good case for the legitimacy and the validity of the Textus Receptus. But just to give you another sort of vantage point on that, there are some other books. that address various issues like the last 12 verses of Mark by Dean John Burgon, who was a scholar of the late 1800s, that wrote a book called The Last 12 Verses of Mark, Vindicated Against Recent Critical Objectors and Established. Again, when the Sinaiticus manuscript was discovered, it was determined that there was a block, an empty space in the manuscript, which really in itself testified to those last verses, but they were not included. And because of that, some have said, well, we don't know if we're going to include verses 9 through 20, if it's really a part of the Bible or not. He makes a brilliant defense for those verses, and just a verse that a book you might want to be aware of. Then you have, all types of material being written out there. The King James Version Debate, A Plea for Realism by D.A. Carson, and arguing for the fact that the King James Version is not the only version. And then there are some that I have also on my desk here that I want to make you aware of. Here's one that, again, takes a position in my opinion, that is to an extreme, but a very good book, Defending the King James Bible, a fourfold superiority on text, translators, technique, and theology. And now they hold to the position that of what some might refer to as King James only position. I do not hold to that position, but I do think that there are some compelling arguments in here for why we should believe that the Textus Receptus is a good Greek copy of the Bible, and that again represents a good text tradition. Also, another I think fairly objective approach to this issue, and sort of a very in a very general introduction to the Bible that is fairly concise and easy to understand, is this by Geisler and Nix, a general introduction to the Bible that gives you has several chapters that discuss the available manuscripts, the extant manuscripts, and then the various philosophies that were involved in translating the Bible. Those are just a few of the books, and there are others out there that would discuss and reveal information about the text type families and the particular Greek text. So let's boil it all down to this as we conclude. We started off talking about which text should we use. Which text should we use? Well, there are three text type sort of traditions, and they are, again, number one, the Textus Receptus, number two, the eclectic method, okay, which is again more of a method or approach, and then represented in the United Bible Society and the Nestle-Aland text, and then number three, the majority text. And so which of those texts? Well, again, I would recommend the majority text. Get copies of all three of them. Use them interchangeably as you can. And but again, that's just sort of an explanation as to why there are some differences in the English translations of the Bible. Well, as we begin to think about our next lesson, we're going to talk about some more practical kinds of things, some aids that will help you in studying through the Greek New Testament. I hope you've enjoyed this class today, and maybe just sort of whetted your appetite for a little bit of the discussion surrounding textual criticism. But I felt it was important to begin our discussion with what Greek texts are available to us and why there are some differences. I encourage you to keep studying, keep utilizing the Greek New Testament, and prepare yourself to minister to others and to serve others. That's what this is all about. May God bless you. I look forward to seeing you in the next session.